Hey everybody, in this video we are going to talk about revolutions, all right, specifically the American and the French Revolution. All right, so we're going to start in America. That revolution happened first. Anyway, all right, at the opening of the American Revolution, about 17% of Americans were members of churches, all right. There are some reasons why this was so low. You know, the Anglicans suddenly became kind of enemies of the state. There were clergy shortages, especially on the frontier churches, and that made going to church pretty difficult. However, even with all these factors, it's undeniable that America was not a particularly religious place at the time of the Revolution. And this actually isn't drastically different from what things were like in the colonial era. It's hard to tell, but scholars have estimated that between the whole colonial era, about 10 to 20% of colonists went to church or were members of churches more specifically. All right, so when we talk about the American Revolution, it actually didn't have much to do with religion. All right. The colonial elite wanted to self-govern. The colonists were upset about taxes and their lack of representation in Parliament. Poor white colonists wanted access to indigenous lands, which the crown had barred. And the relationship between the English and the colonists were kind of just steadily declining. All right. So, as most of us know, on July 4th, 1776, the colonists declared independence from England. France and Spain allied with the colonists. England allied with various Native American tribes. All right. Sometimes when I talk about this war, I'm still surprised the colonists won. All right. The British Navy was the best in the world. The British Empire is the largest empire in history. Okay. But Mad King George was sitting on the throne in England, and the colonists had a brilliant general in Washington, and a absolute desire to separate from England. And of course, a war is hard being fought in a foreign land and things like that. So after 6 long years, the U.S. gained independence from England. Now, in some ways, the revolution was revolutionary, okay? But in many ways, it actually wasn't. There was no aristocracy or king, okay? We didn't have any landed nobility in the United States, unlike England, all right? Though, of course, we had our own kind of elite class, though. There was certainly a commitment to Enlightenment ideals, especially by certain like the founders of the country. But these ideals only went so far. Democracy only extended to landed white men. Many of the founders wrote very eloquent speeches and tracts about freedom, but they kept slaves. All right, so it only goes so far. All right, there was one particular way in which the revolution and this new American government was actually very revolutionary. And that was with separation of church and state. Okay. This really was new. This was the first time this had been tried. All right. Now you might be saying, like, this church and the state aren't completely separate. I know that, but what, but it really is, you could give lots of examples of where the church and the state are intertwined in our society. But that being said, the U.S. never had a church state. They had never established a church. They never forced people to go to church. Okay, this was truly revolutionary. Critical to this view of religion is that membership to a church or a religious organization is voluntary. This is what is so different. This separation allows American religion to develop in some really unique ways as well. So up on the screen, I actually have the Establishment Clause. All right, I put up a video on separation of church and state, which you might find helpful. It's very much looking at the Establishment Clause and then subsequent court cases. So it doesn't really deal with how separation of church and state influenced religion in America. But if you want some additional information on kind of the history of legal proceedings around the Establishment Clause, it's pretty interesting. All right, so kind of back to religion. First, religion and religion adherence is voluntary, as I just said. Churches are voluntary organizations. You don't need to join them. You can, you don't have to. You don't need to give them money. Our tax dollars do not pay for your church. All right, how do you think this influenced American religion? Okay, if you go to, if you go to European countries, you still pay taxes for the churches. All right. This is really what kind of shapes American religion. I remember years ago reading a British historian who called American religious history creative. It was very British. In many ways, he is right, though. America has seen many prophets and church founders. We've had, all these utopian movements, brand new religions. And if you claim to be a prophet, you actually convince people you are, like, you can start your religion. And yes, people might discriminate against you, but you can do it. The government's not actually going to stop you from doing this. So this has resulted in some pretty interesting free market atmosphere for churches. You don't read this book in my class, though Dr. Granquist uses it, The Churching of America by Fink and Stark. It's a really interesting look at American religion kind of through economic terms, specifically through competition. I don't agree with all their assessments, and I don't assign the book, but I do actually think it's a pretty interesting book if you ever want to read it. But I think there is something there. In a sense, churches are competing against each other for better or for worse. There are downsides to this, certainly, but we like to view ourselves as doing God's work and not just another product of a capitalistic society. So there's some hesitation to view churches solely on like this, in this economic view, kind of within a capitalistic society. But there is an upside to this. I think that there has been a creativity and an outreach in American religion that you don't see elsewhere because everything is voluntary, all right? Because pastors aren't paid by the state. There's been some interesting things that have happened, all right? If we were together, I'd open up a discussion on this, but we'll just have to leave it as is for now, and you can think about that. Now, our religious plurality isn't perfect in this country. There has been discrimination against various groups over time, and I do want to name that. But the fact of the matter is, compared to other countries, there has been kind of an incredible level of religious freedom. Okay. Your book mentions the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists as kind of new upstart religions. All right. But there have been so many uniquely American religion. The Church of Latter-day Saints is a really good example. All right. They're probably the best example of a uniquely American religion. And I will talk about them a little bit later in the semester. All right, let's talk about France for a minute. So on the one hand, we get this American Revolution, which is shaping our country, okay? Then in Europe, we have a different revolution, the French Revolution, happening pretty quickly after. The French Revolution is pretty different from the American Revolution. It actually typically gets a bad rap because it was so bloody, but it did have tremendous influence on European politics and religion, okay? So in the U.S., the founders established separation of church and state. France does something a little bit different. Now, I put a video up on Moodle, it's a crash course history, about the French Revolution. It's not really about religion per se, it's really talking about the politics behind the revolution. It's a pretty complicated event, and it's short. John Green does it well, so you can watch that. But I do want to comment a little bit on religion in France to supplement that, all right? The Catholic Church takes a really big hit with the revolution, okay? The one thing that the video I'm going to have you watch doesn't discuss is how much the bourgeoisie really rejected Christianity in France, all right? The video does mention how they got rid of the standard calendar in months and days. You know what? I need to find a picture because the French calendar is really wild and you need to see it, okay? But they eliminated things like Sunday, holy days, saints, all right? Basically anything related to kind of popular devotion, the revolutionaries got rid of, all right? They did things like taking the Blessed Virgin out of Notre Dame and putting in the Goddess of Reason. You know what? the average person did not appreciate these things, okay? Most people like weren't really excited when their country priest was round up and shot, all right? So this kind of attempt to get rid of religion didn't actually go that well in France, though there was a very concerted effort to do that, okay? One of the problems was many of the social services in France were actually provided by the church, okay? And so once the church was more or less abolished in the country, the state wasn't really able to replace them with anything, okay? One of the most particularly devastating things was the removal of nuns, all right? These women typically provided like medical care and education to people in France. And again, when they were removed, they weren't replaced by anything by the state, and this ended up being really negative for a lot of people, okay? So after all this is said and done, the revolution, the reign of terror, right, it's a whole thing. Napoleon decides, they replace one authoritarian leader with another authoritarian leader. That's basically what happens, right? And so you get Napoleon at the end, and Napoleon decides that France is actually much better off with a church, and he formally reestablishes a relationship with the Catholic Church, all right? By the way, he also gets rid of the new calendar system. Okay, so yes, so it's kind of summing up the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution establishes the separation of church and state. The French Revolution tries to get rid of religion, but it doesn't work. And pretty quickly you have a dictator coming in and bringing religion back. All right, but both were very influential kind of in the long term, both politically and religiously in both countries. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here on this video. There'll be another one on the Second Great Awakening coming up. All right, thanks everybody. Bye.